Okay, are we all set? Set to go? Okay.
I think so.
Okay, good evening. Good evening and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Library series on the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Gary Krenz, the director of the observatory. I'm not an astronomer, just to make that clear. I'm pleased to welcome both our online audience participating on YouTube and our in-person audience here at the historic Judy and Stanley Frankel Detroit Observatory. Thanks for coming out on this chilly evening. I'm also pleased to be joined by our panelists, Alan Wald, Steve Batterson, and Peggy Hollingsworth, whom I will introduce in a moment. Tonight, we are going to discuss Chandler Davis, who passed on September 24th, 2022, at the age of 96. Chandler is, of course, one of the 3 faculty members for whom the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom is named. And I'm happy to note that this year's lecture will take place this coming Monday, February 6th, at 4 o'clock p.m. in Hutchins Hall in the law school, the traditional site. We are very happy to have as this year's lecturer Jamelle Bouie, columnist for the New York Times and political analyst for CBS News. Mr. Bouie will speak on Revisiting Du Bois and the Propaganda of History. I hope you can join us there. Tonight, after the introductions, I will start off with some history of the case of Davis Markert Nickerson here at U of M. Then our panel will make remarks, we'll have some discussion, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And after we're done here, the observatory will be open until 9 o'clock, and we have wonderful student docents. I really mean this. They do a fantastic job, who are always happy to show people around and some of the interesting things just up the stairs or elevator. So now our panel, in the order in which they will present. Alan Wald is the H. Chandler Davis Collegiate Professor Emeritus at the University of Michigan. He is a specialist in United States literary radicalism. Here at U of M, he taught in the English department and in American culture for many years. And he is the author of many books, including American Night, The Literary Left in the Era of the Cold War, and The New York Intellectuals, The Rise and Decline of the Anti-Stalinist Left from the 1930s to the 1980s. Steve Batterson is Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at Emory University. He has also been affiliated with the Institute for Advanced Study, Boston University, and UC Berkeley. His mathematical research included dynamical systems and numerical analysis. He is the author of a biography of the mathematician Stephen Smale and of 2 other books on the history of mathematics. His biography of Chandler Davis, The Un-American Treatment of a Red Mathematician in the 1950s, will be published by Monthly Review Press this year, maybe, if I recall. I hope so. Yeah. Peggy Hollingsworth is Assistant Research Professor Emerita in the Medical School. Peggy was chair of the Faculty Senate and the Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs during the 1990-91 academic year when the Davis Markert Nickerson Annual Lecture was established. Her career at Michigan is notable not only for her scholarly research, but for her contributions both to the university and to the community at large in service and faculty governance. And among her many awards are the Sarah Goddard Power Award and the President's Medallion. Peggy served as president of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund for many years and was the driving force behind the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture. So to get us started, I would like to lay out the basic events of 1954 that underlie much of what we'll be talking about tonight. I'm sure that most of you in the audience know the basic facts, so I apologize if I state the obvious, but I think it behooves us to be sure that we all have some shared background. In 1954, 4 U of M faculty members were called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, or more precisely, before a subcommittee chaired by Michigan Congressman Kit Clardy. HUAC was, as I am sure virtually everyone attending knows, investigating alleged disloyalty or subversion by American citizens, with members of the Communist Party particularly suspect in this regard. This is the period that we now know as the McCarthy era, of course, a period of Red Scare and the widespread belief that communists were inherently corrupt, disloyal, subversive, and completely under the mind control of the party, and by extension, the Soviet Union. Many people in a wide range of occupations across the country were investigated by the FBI, called to testify before Senate and House committees, and asked to name names. Those going before the committees had many decisions to make, including whether to cooperate and answer the committee's questions, often being called upon to betray others. One of the most potent tools at the disposal of these committees was an indirect one: the cooperation of employers, private organizations, and other institutions, including schools and universities, in this witch hunt. Relatively few people were sent to prison. Vast numbers were fired or blacklisted in one form or another. In 1954, these investigations had recently begun to focus on higher education, and thus we returned to the faculty at U of M. The faculty members were Chandler Davis, an instructor in mathematics, Clement Markert, a professor in zoology, Mark Nickerson, a tenured professor in pharmacology, and Lawrence Klein, a professor of economics. Klein decided to cooperate. Davis, Markert, and Nickerson determined not to, though their approaches were different. Markert and Nickerson refused to answer the committee's questions on the basis of the First Amendment's protections of free speech and free assembly, and on the Fifth Amendment's protections against self-incrimination. Davis, for reasons that will become more clear as the evening goes on, called on the First Amendment alone. Sorry, page is out of order. Immediately after their meetings with HUAC, Davis, Markert, and Nickerson were suspended by President Harlan Hatcher pending investigation. It should be noted that Hatcher, just the year before, had induced the Faculty Senate to modify the bylaws concerning dismissal of faculty and expand the president's authority to initiate such investigations. What happened next involved not one, but up to 3 university committees. Upon suspension, Hatcher asked the Executive Committee of LSA, in the cases of Markert and Davis, and of the medical school, in the case of Nickerson, to investigate. However, because of ambiguities in the revised bylaws, and also perhaps as a result of maneuvering by President Hatcher to attain the outcome he desired, the story didn't end there. Hatcher called for another committee, a special advisory committee, or sometimes called the ad hoc committee, to be appointed by the Faculty Senate to conduct an investigation. Following recommendations from that committee, there was a third committee that could act as a sort of appeals committee. So what were the outcomes? Simply put, in the case of Mark Nickerson, the medical school executive committee recommended dismissal on the grounds that his refusal to cooperate with HUAC and his refusal to renounce the Communist Party weakened his colleagues' confidence in him. Clearly there was something more going on there. The Special Advisory Committee, however, and the Bylaws Committee both recommended reinstatement. Nonetheless, Hatcher recommended to the Board of Regents that Nickerson be terminated, stating that he was a communist in spirit, and he was dismissed. In the case of Clement Markert, the college executive committee was prepared to recommend reinstatement, largely on the basis of his forthrightness about his political commitments in his testimony to the committee. Hatcher learned about the leanings of the committee in advance, which is perhaps why he asked for the Special Advisory Committee. That committee recommended reinstatement with censure. Markert chose not to appeal. He was in fact reinstated, but left U of M soon thereafter. In the case of Chandler Davis, the college executive committee recommended reinstatement, but both the Special Advisory Committee and the Appeals Committee recommended dismissal, and he was dismissed. There we go. I think they're all in order now, so I apologize. So what is going on here? There are complicated issues, too much for us to fully unpack this evening, but important for us to try to understand in no small part because of the anti-intellectual hysteria that we are witnessing today. There are, of course, questions of constitutional rights under the First and Fifth Amendments, the relationship of those rights to each other, and the ways in which they bear on people's decisions and behaviors under the stress of persecution and oppression. There is also the question of how those rights relate to academic freedom, which is in many ways a strange beast, not well understood outside of the academy and not always well understood inside the academy. Academic freedom is premised on, among other things, the idea that those who engage in academic activity may do so freely but must do so competently. The entity that determines competence is the faculty itself, the academic community, and we see at play here a sort of tension within the concept. The idea of the academic community in some ways underlay what was the standing position of the Association of American Universities, AAU, with respect to the congressional investigations. Namely, that a faculty member who refused to be forthcoming with congressional committees had to justify that position to faculty peers. To do otherwise was to withhold important information, not from the government, but from colleagues, raised questions of dishonesty and lack of integrity. In addition, as we've said, many people, including members of the academic community, demonized communists as lacking in intellectual autonomy and therefore inherently incapable of commitment to a true academic enterprise. President Hatcher was a strong proponent of the AAU position. Davis, Markert, and Nickerson all refused to answer HUAC's questions. With the university committees, Markert and Nickerson were quite open about their politics, their former membership in the Communist Party, and their current thoughts about the party. This openness carried weight with the Special Advisory Committee and, in Nickerson's case, the Bylaws Committee, the Appeals Committee as well. Davis, on the other hand, refused with the university committees to discuss his political commitments or actions, maintaining that his freedom of speech extended to his relationships with the university and with the academic community. Moreover, to answer the same questions that had been put forward by HUAC was essentially to answer to HUAC. Agreeing that his integrity was a legitimate concern of the committees, he averred that there were many ways that the committees could get at that issue directly and that political affiliation had nothing to do with it. The upshot is interesting. The College Executive Committee recommended reinstatement somewhat grudgingly. The committee concluded that they had no evidence that he was a member of the Communist Party and that his, quote, unwillingness to cooperate with the committee alone could not be considered adequate grounds for dismissal. As distasteful as apparently some of the members of the committee found that lack of cooperation. The other committees, however, had no qualms about dismissal. Davis's failure to discuss the party or his political views was fatal. As the Special Advisory Committee put it, quote, we believe that a strong, if not absolutely convincing case exists for disciplinary action or dismissal against a faculty member simply on the basis that he refuses to state fully and frankly to his colleagues and to the university the facts concerning his past or present communist affiliations and activities, if any. In addition, the committees had no hesitancy in essentially concluding that Davis must have been guilty of something that he was hiding and therefore must be a proponent of communism in one way or another. So Davis was dismissed, but he carried forward his constitutional fight, as we'll hear. His approach challenged the constitutionality of HUAC and highlighted the complicity of organizations like the university in the government hunts, even organizations supposedly so dedicated to freedom of mind. So I just want to end by saying that I did not know Chandler Davis nearly as well as any of the panelists tonight. But there are people who simply exude human decency, incisiveness, a sense of justice, and generous spirit, and he was one of them. And it really is one of the privileges of my career to have known him at all. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Alan for some context.
Thanks for that excellent introduction, Gary. And it's truly an honor to partake in this event tonight. Let me start by asking, how do we assess the historic import of H. Chandler Davis' expulsion from the academic community in 1954 and the way it affected his thinking and his activism over the next 6.5 decades? And how was it possible for a person of such an extraordinary ethical makeup and high principles to be sacked essentially through character defamation, specifically for being, quote, devious and, quote, lacking integrity? This was the view of President Harlem Hatcher, who, with administrative and faculty facilitators and in close collaboration with the FBI and the House Un-American Activities Committee, orchestrated the mathematician's persecution and his firing. In contrast, when I look back on Davis's life as a whole, I find that Chan, as he was called by his friends, to be an exemplar of the kind of committed activist that many of us would like to be. Chan was targeted and hounded during a McCarthy-era anti-communist witch hunt, but he did not regard himself as a victim. He fought back without ever seeming self-serving or like a martyr lamenting. Chan was also a mathematical genius, with a polymathic but playful mind, and one that composed poetry and music. From childhood, he gave the impression of having a stream of otherworldliness, later demonstrated by his association with a group of bohemian radical science fiction writers now celebrated as the Futurians. But I need to begin by cautioning that while the archive on the 1954 events has expanded over the past decades, it is still replete with gaps and contradictions. And one of my hopes is that UM's recently announced Inclusive History Project will further take up some of the matters raised here. That's because the context and the process in 1954 reveal much about the hubris of academic culture and its precarious connection to the larger society. First, on the context. When Donald J. Trump rolled out his campaign for a third presidential bid in New Hampshire just 6 days ago, the New York Times reported that Trump, quote, framed his candidacy as a shield for the country from communism and Marxism, and vowed to keep transgender athletes out of women's sports. Yesterday, I saw in the Times that Florida Governor DeSantis has launched a, quote, crusade against, quote, agendas hostile to academic freedom. He plans to do this by eliminating, quote, diversity and equity programs and reducing, quote, the protections of tenure. Now, reading these lines felt like a stark, sobering reminder that the past is not past, and that the 1954 cancellation of a 28-year-old UM math instructor from the academic community had far more cultural significance than simply a vital academic freedom and First Amendment case. That's because the context was a national climate of fear and the exploitation of that fear by political actors with a demagogic skill at creating left-wing boogeymen. In 1954, it was Reds under the bed. Today, it's baby-eating devil worshippers, drag queen story hours, critical race theory in advanced placement courses, and transgender athletes. Of course, there are differences. During World War II, primarily, there had been conspiratorial activity by several hundred pro-communists who passed information along to agents of our then Soviet ally. But none of the professors subpoenaed but in the HUAC hearings had any demonstrable connection with this. I've compared the names of the accused spies with faculty targeted by HUAC, and there is no overlap. In their 1995 book, The Secret World of American Communism, the conservative anti-communist espionage experts, Haynes and Clare, write, quote, there were many worlds of American communism, including a public one where the party devoted its energies to organizing workers into trade unions and opposing segregation. Most party members lived in that public world. They had no connection with or even knowledge of another world that recruited members for clandestine espionage work. So, the investigation into UM was essentially a snipe hunt. Also, that post-World War II purge was distinct from many of the controversies about which we now read in the Chronicle of Higher Education. These sometimes questionable allegations concern individuals in the classroom or in their writing, but Chan's teaching, research, and his public statements were never questioned. What was at issue was that he was part of a social movement, the section of the U.S. left led by the Communist Party, and he believed that neither he nor anyone else should have to repudiate this identification to maintain their job. His parents had been academic party members, and he said that his mother remained loyal until her 1960 death. Moreover, he loved and admired lifelong communist professors such as mathematicians Dirk Stewart at MIT, who was never fired, and Lee Lorch, a heroic civil rights activist, much fired, who ended up at the University of Toronto with Chan. As Chan saw it, the communist movement was part of an ecosystem of anti-racist and peace campaigners, and exclusion from academic life would largely destroy activism and dissent, which happened, the silent generation. This is why Chan, as he navigated his political stances later in life, did not want his case to be weaponized against the contemporary activist social justice left, as he explained in a brilliant, unpublished letter to the Ann Arbor News in 1990. And this was also why he repeatedly emphasized in emails throughout the years that his own top priority was the defense of Palestinian human rights activists against what he believed was the beginning of a new blacklist, one already inaugurated by the political firings of Stephen Saleta and Norman Finkelstein. Chan's demand was never for personal reinstatement or back pay, but for the to open its doors to institutionalize dissenting political thought, perhaps by hiring some of those cast out. Now, comparing atrocities is always a tricky business, but the cost of his and others' 1954 refusal to cooperate with the investigating committees may be hard to appreciate today. Remember that Davis, Market, and Nickerson were accused by HUAC of being part of a, quote, criminal conspiracy to overthrow the government by force and violence. In 1954, to have large photographs of one's faces on the front page of newspapers with headlines declaring, quote, 3 professors suspended in red probe was even worse than being accused today of alleged racist or sexist behavior by Twitter gunslingers. It was almost the equivalent of being accused of association with a terrorist cell. And violence against alleged Reds was in the air. We can see that clearly in public statements by Congressional Representative Kit Clardy, who conducted the Lansing HUAC hearings and with whom Hatcher formed a tacit alliance. In 1954, Clardy, known as Michigan's McCarthy, conducted a HUAC hearing in Flint, described in Frank Donner's book, The Un-Americans. There, Clardy, quote, not only abused the witnesses, but incited violence against them, recalling how in 1937, college youths had thrown union organizers from the UAW-CIO into the Red Cedar River, declaring, quote, I was proud of those kids. They should also have tossed into the river the then governor, the late Frank Murphy. Donner explains that Clardy's conduct of the hearing contributed to the brutality that followed. Quote, workers were dragged from their jobs in automobile plants and beaten. Hostile witnesses were evicted from their homes. Their families had to go into hiding to escape the fury of mob hoodlums. The office of the lawyer for the witnesses was smeared with red paint. Now in Lansing, Chan was accused of being part of a criminal conspiracy, yet the only evidence that was that he had signed a check for the publication of the anti-HUAC pamphlet Operation Mind, written by graduate student Natalie Zeman Davis and psychology instructor Elizabeth Duvan. However, HUAC and the universities worked as a team, one smearing, the other punishing. The day after his testimony, Chan, who had pled the First Amendment, was suspended from his job by Hatcher alongside Margaret Nickerson, who had pled the Fifth. Now this leads to my second concern, which is the process by which President Hatcher dismissed Chan. What do we know of this process? Little research seems to have been done on Hatcher's background, but as a specialist in the 1930s, I'm aware that he was an editor of the Federal Writers Project's American Guide and wrote at least one proletarian novel. So he was likely to be a New Deal liberal, a very different breed from whack jobs like Kit Clardy. Nevertheless, as the political winds shifted with HUAC hearings reaching Michigan in 1953, Hatcher seemed to change positions like a weather vane. First, while the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, had an unambiguous stance that membership in the Communist Party was not sufficient grounds for dismissal, Hatcher chose to align with a different organization, the American Association of Universities, AAU. In 1953, he signed the AAU proclamation avowing that merely believing in the ideas of communism without membership was grounds for dismissal. Moreover, the statement defined integrity as, quote, revealing one's political ideas both to university colleagues and the public. Finally, it claimed that use of the Fifth Amendment meant that the professor would have the, quote, heavy burden of proof of his fitness to hold a university position. In other words, due process would be reversed. No one would have to prove your guilt. You would have to prove your innocence. But even before he signed the AAU statement, Hatcher had personally telegrammed the chairman of HUAC in Washington, Harold J. Velde, to inform him that Michigan would cooperate to the fullest extent, quote, to the fullest extent with whatever plans Velde had for investigating our faculty. He then sent his emissary, Dean of Faculty Marvin Nihus, to negotiate the deal to put Davis and 4 others in the crosshairs. Again, as with Kit Clardy, this was an alliance with a very unsavory character, another Marjorie Taylor Greene type. In his book Naming Names, Victor Navasky describes Velde as, quote, having the demagogic capacity to exploit nativism and know-nothing passion. Just 4 years earlier, Velde had charged that President Truman was trying to, quote, cover up and protect Soviet plans to establish, by force and violence, a communistic or socialistic United States. So Velde subpoenaed Truman himself in 1953, along with the leaders of the Boy Scouts and the CIA. Was this guy a flame-throwing fantasist or what? Yet Hatcher, instead of increasing the protective measures for UM faculty, did the opposite. He announced that there had to be new measures to dismiss faculty more easily in, quote, exceptional cases of emergency character. These measures included the authority of Hatcher himself to initiate the action for dismissal, the shortening of any appeal process from the normal 20 down to 5 days, and an allowance of only 1 hearing instead of the original 2. Many UN professors did object to what was happening, but it was only early on. Yet by creating a fear of poking the bear and giving credibility to dubious claims of secret information passed on by the FBI and Red Squad, the Hatcher and AAU view took over. When the LSNA Executive Committee looked at the situation and concluded that both Market and Davis should be reinstated, Nickerson was not an LSNA, Hatcher didn't like the results, so he went on to appoint a new committee, the Special Advisory Committee, the Smith Committee, joined by SACUA's Campbell Committee. These were to interrogate the suspected faculty to determine their integrity, but according to one criterion, answering the communist belonging probe through the binary of yes or no. Chan, although he was vigorously supported by the math department that vouched for his integrity, failed the test. He did talk candidly about his views on violence, but he would not answer the membership question. We now know that Chan had left the Communist Party in the spring of 1953 because he felt it was no longer effective. He'd always been an oddball party member, attracted to logical positivism at Harvard, hanging out with Trotskyists, anarchists, pacifists, even former party members turned hostile. He was worried about repression in the Soviet Union, although to his later embarrassment, he wrote me that he felt the death of Stalin in 1953 was in some sense, quote, the loss of a leader. But now he thought it could be more effective in other organizations. He did report this decision to a colleague in casual conversation, yet to announce in a public forum, after having been subpoenaed and threatened if he did not comply, seemed like a breaking of solidarity, the giving of ammunition to those out to hurt the progressive movement. He obviously couldn't answer the membership question yes, but he couldn't answer no. He did not want his job reinstated on the grounds that he had quit the party. However, he wanted to be consistent about defending his First Amendment right to keep one's politics to oneself when faced with threats. Now, much more could be said on all this, but remember that Nickerson did candidly explain that he quit the party, yet it turned out that this community that he was supposed to trust, this family, was not free of score-settling behavior. The chair of his department, apparently jealous of Nickerson's growing fame, declared Nickerson, quote, too anti-authoritarian, greenlighting Hatcher to overrule the ad hoc committee and fire the tenured Nickerson as a, quote, communist in spirit. Markert, who also explains he'd broken totally with the party, was censured but reinstated, although at that time the plan was to deny tenure. Most shocking was the fate of future Nobel Prize winner Lawrence Klein, a friendly witness, even naming a few names or two. The far-right economist William Patton, claiming that Klein's candid acknowledgement that he still supported, quote, Norwegian-style socialism marked him as a totalitarian, successfully ended Klein's career. With Klein up for a fast-track promotion to full professor, Patton convinced Hatcher and Neuhaus to offer the superstar Klein only a non-tenured position with one-year contracts. But according to the chair of economics, Patton actually believed Klein to be part of a conspiracy to solidify, quote, Jewish control over the department. And future Dean Haber also noted Patton's anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, the regents went on to deny Klein a tenured position and later to name a UM building after Patton, who was a close friend of Hatcher's Lieutenant Neuhaus. Chan's life, however, became a monument to his own integrity. His decisions were based on core values, not just fear of poking the bear. To the end, he burned with a useful sense of injustice. Let's hope that he was not the last of a kind.
Thank you.
This is my wife and my IT person. Is it on? So I would like to discuss Chandler Davis's courageous First Amendment stand before the House Un-American Activities Committee, known as HUAC, and I will place it in the context of other First Amendment type stands, including the Hollywood 10, who also went to prison, and Pete Seeger, who did not. So questions like, why did Chandler pursue the First Amendment after it had failed for the Hollywood 10, and why did Pete Seeger get off and Chandler didn't? Those are the sort of questions I'd like to go into. So Chandler's HUAC hearing was on May 10th, 1954, before a subcommittee consisting of Congressmen Scheer, Clardy, and Mulder. The panel knew through the FBI that Chandler had been a member of the Communist Party. Oops, I'm not good at this. Here we go. HUAC knew through the FBI that Chandler had been a member of the Communist Party while he was a student at Harvard, and also as an instructor at Michigan. HUAC mistakenly believed that Chandler was still a member despite the fact that he had withdrawn from the party a year earlier. In preparing for his hearing, Chandler could expect that he would be asked some form of what I call the communist question. Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? He would then be expected to name the names of other members, which would have been an intolerable act for him. If he refused to cooperate, the only existing safe harbor from prosecution for contempt of Congress was to invoke the Fifth Amendment. A likely ramification of taking the Fifth would be being fired by the University of Michigan. But for Chandler, there was an even more important consideration. He had seen that other people taking the Fifth were marginalized in the press as Fifth Amendment communists and then scorned by society. Chandler wanted to act against this injustice. Almost every HUAC witness with communist priors made the unsavory choice between naming names and taking the Fifth. The course that Chandler chose was to claim that the First Amendment, with its freedom of speech protections, prohibited HUAC from examining his political activities. It was an unusual but not unique course that had already been pursued unsuccessfully by others, namely the Hollywood 10. The Hollywood 10 were a collection of mostly screenwriters who were convicted of contempt of Congress in district court 6 years prior to Chandler's HUAC hearing. Not only did they lose in the Court of Appeals on a unanimous opinion, but the three-judge panel upheld the right of Congress to ask the communist question. In 1950, the Hollywood 10's petition for review by the Supreme Court was unsuccessful when only Justices Douglas and Black voted to grant cert, that is, to hear the case. At about the same time, 2 other HUAC First Amendment contempt convictions were sustained by other panels on the Court of Appeals, both on 2-1 votes. Neither of these cases reached the Supreme Court. So, in 1954, Chandler was 27 years old, with 1 year remaining on his instructor's contract. He had 1 child, and his pregnant wife, Natalie, was a graduate student in history. His intention was to use the freedom of speech argument put forward by philosopher Alexander Michelson to persuade the Supreme Court to end the persecution of left-wing individuals by HUAC. The odds against him were enormous. While the First Amendment defense had never been taken up by the Supreme Court, it had failed all 3 times in the circuit courts. Chandler was virtually certain to lose at the district level. If he lost in the Court of Appeals, then it was very unlikely the Supreme Court would even hear his case. Even if they did, the 1954 makeup of the court appeared unfavorable for him. Only Justices Black and Douglas held records aligned with Chandler's position. While Chief Justice Warren would later become known for charting the course of a liberal court, he was then in his first year, and the former prosecutor was just developing his judicial philosophy. Justice Felix Frankfurter, despite his earlier notoriety as a liberal Harvard law professor, was disposed against reigning in Congress for reasons I will explain shortly. The other 5 justices held conservative records. Subsequent appointments by then President Eisenhower held the likelihood of an even less favorable bench. The most likely outcome for Chandler was that he would be fired by Michigan, indicted, convicted, and fail to reach the Supreme Court. Nevertheless, he persisted. So, at his HUAC hearing, Chandler cited only the First Amendment to justify his non-responsiveness. As expected, he was then fired and indicted. The 1956 district court trial was frustrating for Chandler. His attorney, seeking to establish a record for appeal, repeatedly objected on the basis of procedural grounds, such as whether or not Chandler had been directed to answer certain questions. Chandler did not want to get off on a technicality. He was anxious to lose in the district court so that he would have the standing to push the First Amendment issue to the Supreme Court. Chandler may have been unique among the First Amendment defendants in that he did not want to get off on a technicality. His objective was to end the HUAC persecution of everyone. So Chandler's district court judge delayed his ruling for 7 months in order to wait on the Supreme Court's decision in another HUAC contempt case. John Watkins was an official in a labor union with ties to the Communist Party. He had been identified as a party member by foes of his from the union. At his HUAC hearing, Watkins denied that he'd ever been a member of the Communist Party. He did not mention either the First or Fifth Amendments. He merely refused to answer questions as to whether or not former associates were members of the party. The issue of whether he could be forced to answer questions from HUAC was relevant to Chandler's case. As it turned out, Watkins was a lucky guy. In the period before his oral argument with the Supreme Court, there were 3 personnel developments that affected who would decide his case. Justice Harold Burton recused himself because his nephew was involved in the prosecution. Justice Sherman Minton retired and was replaced by liberal William Brennan. And Justice Stanley Reed retired and was not replaced until after oral argument. From all these developments, the effect was that 3 likely votes against Watkins were replaced with 1 vote that was likely in his favor. Of the 7 justices deciding Watkins' case, 4 were the court's liberals: Warren, Black, Justice, and Brennan. The key player in the Watkins decision was, the key players in the Watkins decision were Frankfurter and Warren. Frankfurter was an advocate of judicial restraint. This meant that the court should defer to the elected representatives of the legislature except in cases of egregious violations of the Constitution. On the other hand, Warren, from his youthful experiences, was sympathetic with hardworking people oppressed by overwhelming forces. During oral argument, Frankfurter repeatedly took issue with the failure of HUAC to inform Watkins of the pertinence of the questions he refused to answer. At the Justices' Conference, Warren was supportive of Watkins, feeling that he had made a good faith effort to cooperate, only drawing the line at becoming an informant. Warren felt that HUAC was abusing its power and exposing an individual's private behavior in order to advance the committee's agenda. The other three liberals supported Warren. Frankfurter also favored ruling in favor of Watkins, but only on the narrow grounds that he had raised during the hearing. Harlan agreed with Frankfurter, and Justice Clark supported sustaining the conviction. Warren designated himself to write the opinion for the court. His draft had separate parts, making the civil liberties arguments to the liberals and the lack of justification of pertinency argued by Frankfurter. There were three drafts, with the latter two heavily shaped by admonitions from Frankfurter to tone down the civil liberties elements. The second draft included a paragraph that stated that the nature of HUAC's questioning of the witness was impermissible and overturning the conviction on that basis. If this paragraph had remained in the final ruling, it's hard to see how Chandler's district court judge, who was waiting on the decision, could have done anything other than dismiss the charges against him. Frankfurter, however, persuaded Warren to delete the paragraph. The result was an ambiguous opinion with discussion of civil liberties, but whose only explicit ruling was on the narrow due process issue of establishing pertinence to the witness. Chandler's judge concluded that Chandler had received sufficient notification and found him guilty of contempt. Other judges interpreted Watkins differently and more in favor of non-cooperative witnesses. Chandler's First Amendment issue would not be addressed directly by the Supreme Court until the case of Lloyd Barenblatt was decided in 1959. Barenblatt, whose HUAC hearing was 1 month after Chandler's, took a very similar stance with HUAC as Chandler. By this time, conservative Charles Whitaker had replaced Reed, and moderate Potter Stewart had replaced Burton on the court. So the case shaped up with 4 liberals, 4 conservatives, and Potter Stewart as the tiebreaker. Stewart sided with the conservatives to convict Barenblatt of contempt. Now I'd like to read the next couple paragraphs from my notes so that I get it right. Both Harlan in his opinion for the court and Black in his dissent directly addressed the freedom of speech issue that Chandler had sought to raise. Writing for the 5-judge majority, Harlan ruled that on such matters as the communist question, protections provided to an individual by freedom of speech needed to be balanced against the interest of Congress. Asserting an axiom of society's right of self-preservation, in that the tenets of the Communist Party include the overthrow of the government of the United States by force and violence, Harlan held that the needs of Congress trumped the First Amendment. Hugo Black was an originalist who believed that the text of the Constitution meant what it was originally intended to mean. For Black, when it came to the First Amendment, balancing was sacrilege. So I'm going to quote a paragraph from Black's dissent. To apply the court's balancing test under such circumstances is to read the First Amendment to say that Congress shall pass no law abridging freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition unless Congress and the Supreme Court reach the joint conclusion that on balance the interest of the people, that on balance the interest of the government in stifling these freedoms is greater than the interest of the people in having them exercised. This is closely akin to the notion that neither the First Amendment nor any other provision of the Bill of Rights should be enforced unless the court believes it is reasonable to do so. Not only does this violate the genius of our written Constitution, but it runs expressly counter to the injunction to court and Congress made by Madison when he introduced the Bill of Rights. 2 months after Barron-Blatt came down, the Court of Appeals affirmed Chandler's conviction. Only Black and Douglas voted to grant cert. Warren may have been influenced by a clerk whose analysis was that granting cert would only give the conservatives an opportunity to write more bad law. Chandler and Barron-Blatt both served 6 months sentences in federal prison. Over the next few years, some First Amendment HUAC witnesses went to prison, while others got off on the procedural grounds of Watkins, that they hadn't been sufficiently informed. The turning point came in the prosecution. The turning point in the prosecution over refusal to answer the communist question came in 1962, too late for Chandler, who had already completed his time. The case, Russell versus U.S., involved 6 petitioners reviewed together who had been convicted separately of contempt for lack of cooperation with HUAC and a Senate committee. Oral argument took place before exactly the same justices who had heard Barron-Blatt. In a surprising reversal, Stewart sided with the liberals to quash the conviction, not by overturning Barron-Blatt, but on a technicality with the indictment. At about the same time, Pete Seeger, who had refused to answer the communist question in a HUAC hearing in 1955, had his conviction reversed by another panel of the Court of Appeals on the same flaw with the indictment. Most significantly, with Byron White and Arthur Goldberg replacing Whitaker and Frankfurter in 1962, the Supreme Court became more receptive to challenges based on civil liberties. So this completes my review. There's more in my book, The Un-American Treatment of a Red Mathematician in the 1960s, to be published by Monthly Review Press. But I'd just like to say in closing that Chandler Davis acted with great courage and rare selflessness in his efforts on behalf of freedom of speech and the left, but he became one of a small number of people to serve time in prison as a consequence of his HUAC testimony. Thank you very much.
Circumstances frequently occur where the impact or an event is not manifested until many years into the future. Such is the case with the establishment of the Davis Margaret Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom, DMN, and the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, AFL. The trauma imposed upon Chandler Davis, Clement Margaret, and Mark Nickerson, in addition to innumerable others, both within and outside the Academy during the 1940s and 1950s McCarthy era witch hunts, has been well documented. Consequences of those events were memorialized in Adam Kulikow's 1989 undergraduate honors thesis, keeping in mind the McCarthy era at the University of Michigan, that included interviews of Davis, Margaret, and Nickerson. In 1989, representatives of the University of Michigan chapter of the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, contacted various university administrators to encourage the University of Michigan Regents to endorse a significant gesture of reconciliation for the 3 professors. The effort was unsuccessful. The Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs, SACUA, was also contacted, and overtures were made to then President James Duderstadt, former President Harlan Hatcher, and the University of Michigan Regents. They too were unsuccessful. It is noteworthy that prior to contacting any of the university officials, legal guidance was sought from the Office of the General Counsel to determine if there would be any legal ramifications of an apology. The response was that it would be unlikely, especially because of the time that had elapsed. In 1990, the Senate Assembly passed a resolution that deeply regretted, quote, the failure of the university community to protect their values of intellectual freedom in 1954 and established the Davis Margaret Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom, DMN, and the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, AFLF. The AFLF was to organize and raise funds to support the annual lecture. The initial financial support for the lecture was, for the most part, from the faculty, with matching funds from the National AAUP Committee A. In addition, an anonymous donor made two sizable contributions, the first in 2010 and the second in 2012. These anonymous donor funds now support the annual DMN. AAUP 1940 Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom and Tenure states the following, quote, the purpose of this statement is to promote public understanding and support of academic freedom and tenure, and agreement upon procedures to ensure them in colleges and universities. Institutions of higher education are conducted for the common good and not to further the interests of either the individual teacher or the institution as a whole. The common good depends upon free speech for truth and its free exposition. Secondly, academic freedom is essential to these purposes and applies to both teaching and research. Freedom in research is fundamental to the advancement of truth. Academic freedom in its teaching aspect is fundamental for the protection of rights of the teacher in teaching and the student to freedom in learning. It carries with it duties correlative with rights, end quotation. There are many within the academic community who benefit from academic freedom, but unfortunately they are unaware of its impact on their lives, professionally or personally, until it is compromised or indeed no longer exists for them. The United States remains one of the more favorable places in the world where there remains, to some extent, freedom to conduct one's teaching and research. Yet globally, the situation in many instances is grim, resulting in harassment and even imprisonment. A thread that emerged in a number of the DMN was a warning about the corporatization of academic institutions, the increase in administrators, the decrease in faculty numbers, loss of employment, and lessening involvement of faculty in governance. To what extent do current situations mirror what happened to Chandler Davis, Clement Markert, and Mark Nickerson in the 1950s? The parallels are quite remarkable. As the number of faculty positions decreases, involvement in faculty government also decreases, and the protection for the individual faculty member is further compromised. My first meeting with the honorees was in 1991 at Robert O'Neill's inaugural lecture. It was fascinating for me to have conversations with them and to meet their families. Those meetings with all three honorees continued until Nickerson and Markert passed in 1998 and 1999, respectively. Chandler and I continued to meet annually during the DMN activities until 2017, and thereafter we kept in touch primarily by means of email. In 1992, Lee C. Bollinger, who was Dean of the University of Michigan Law School, presented the second DMN in the series and stated at the time that what had occurred was wrong. He regarded the response from the University of Michigan an institutional rather than an individual failing, an example with regard to Harlan Hatcher. Subsequently, either the president, provost, a dean, or someone in their offices introduced the speaker. Much has been discussed about the trauma experienced by Davis, Markert, and Nickerson, but less about the impact on their families, an area of particular interest to me. I would now like to address the experiences of their families. Clement Markert retained his position and once tenured left the University of Michigan. Ostensibly, his family did not suffer the personal attacks of the Davis and Nickerson families. In 2015, when I went to speak with his children about their experiences, only Clement's daughter, Samantha Margaret Schreck, would engage in a discussion with me. She indicated that her brothers had shut off that period of their lives. She remembered that at their home in the evenings, after the meals were together, their mother would clear the dishes and kitchen while her father played the piano. Mark Nickerson, although tenured, suffered a more dire fate and trauma to himself and to his family. They suffered many cruelties. Mike Nickerson, Mark's son, detailed what had happened to his family. Nickerson's first wife, Betty, described in her writings in 1954 that a group assembled outside their home were yelling and hitting the screen door with feces and attempting to intimidate them, calling them quote-unquote commies. There was a further kerfuffle in the waiting room when Betsy was delivering her daughter. They wanted to see the communist baby. His brother Steve was stabbed, apparently by a classmate, that resulted in a police escort to attend school. How damaging to a mother with a baby, a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old just going to school. They had to flee Ann Arbor. Chandler Davis assumed that the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution would protect him from the accusations against him. That proved to be incorrect. As a result, he was not only separated from his University of Michigan position, but equally, if not more importantly, from his family. In 2015, when Natalie Zeman Davis and Joan Wallach Scott were here on the 25th anniversary of the lecture series, the opportunity was taken to obtain oral interviews on October the 16th from the Davis family and from others. In the following will be recounted the observations made by members of the Davis family. These observations will not only speak to the loss of collegiality within the university, but also the stress and trauma experienced by family members when the principles of academic and intellectual freedom were not upheld. Adam Kulikow served as primary interviewer with additional questions for clarification and elaboration from Charles Smith and myself. In most cases, the following are in their own words. When we spoke to Simone Davis, Chandler's daughter, she indicated that it, quote, flavored, unquote, her life and caused a complicated relationship with the land where she was born. Her profession and prison education was shaped by the stigma and hardships associated with her father's time in prison. It is her belief that his position was a powerful, beautiful choice and the right thing to do under the circumstances. Aaron Davis, Chandler's son, said that most of his friends and those of their parents were friendly, but others would not permit their children to play with them. He described an incident in which his teacher took him and his sister Hannah to each classroom in their school to tell other students that their father was in jail. They asked their mother if the teacher was trying to torture, make things difficult, or public shame them. She responded, quote, no, they were sympathetic, and it was because he did something good. It was a way to normalize the situation, end quote. Aaron mentioned that Chandler's family was Quakers and activists. His great-grandfather, Norwood Penrose Hollowell, and his brother, Needless Hollowell, were commanders of the Massachusetts 54th Infantry Regiment, an African-American regiment in the American Civil War. They were abolitionists, and they also were involved in the Underground Railroad. He reiterated that they were united as a family, that Dad did the right thing. He thought there should be, quote, some sort of vindication for the stand on principles that his father took, because essentially what he was doing was holding the ideas of freedom of speech, ideas of the founding fathers that really are the reason a lot of people came to the United States in the first place, end quotes. He commented that, quote, the chill of the McCarthy era is a chill that we do not ever want to forget today, end quote. Natalie Davis, Chandler's wife, was concerned about her pregnancy at the time Chandler received his subpoena in 1953. the loss of her passport, and the impact on her research. She was fortunate to have friends to support them in a way that Betsy and Mark Nickerson did not. Psychologically, it was much easier for that family. What was harder than the 6-year court course that was taking too long was the fact that Chandler had no regular academic job. There were now 3 children, and she wanted to teach and have a regular life. There was a feeling of isolation and a sense of abandonment. It was a hard personal experience. It was a great relief when he obtained a job in Canada. However, they were initially turned down by the Minister of Immigration because Chandler had a criminal record. When the Minister of Immigration was fired, and through the efforts of the Canadian Association of Teachers, that's CAUT, they were admitted to Canada. Quote, "We had a place to be." Chandler was welcomed, and finally, gradually, I found a way to have my own career there. End quotes. We then spoke with Chandler Davis. He indicated Natalie was not convinced of his position, but thought it was reasonable to take because he believed it. Chandler added that Nickerson thought his position was the right one. Chandler remarked that some of the faculty acted as an extension of the Inquisition, both objectively and politically. And we've heard that from the other 2 panelists. Quote, "All kinds of people did not offer me jobs. Some never said, 'Isn't it too bad we weren't able to make you an offer?' Duty in hiring was whatever would result in the smoothest professional progress in the department. Having to fight over one of the appointments was not going to be any professional feather in their caps. The few people who felt otherwise felt not only that I would do a good job if hired, which I guess I would have, but it was a damn shame for me to wander in the wilderness," end quote. Quote, "In some cases, people were being vicious. In other cases, just interpreting their duty as a member of the department to exclude having a gratuitous academic case with no negative will toward me," end quote. The collateral damage was manifest in ties being severed with family members, the personal antipathy, and the falling out with very good friends. The question was asked, did the Red Hut win? Chandler responded, quote, "It won in the sense that there is a new normal. The new normal is when you talk about inequality of economic rewards, and you did only a certain type of economics. There were certain expectations in intellectual discourse which were not the same as they had been 10 years earlier. That happens all the time in history, that in the center of normal discourse shifts. The Red Hunt succeeded very markedly in shifting the center. It was part of the victory of the Red Hunt," end quotes. Chandler was then asked, "How much did you suffer?" Quote, "I lived differently than I would have. I don't think I lived wrong. I don't think I lost perspective on the issues that divide us as a result of being persecuted for my positions. Among those who were once in the Communist Party, there was enormous diversity in their current thinking and in their experiences while in the party. The world is much richer than any set of stereotypes allow you to see. And I think that understanding that is one of the most important things we can do in order to move beyond that impression," end quote. However, in spite of these earlier disruptions in the lives of Davis, Market, and Nickerson, they were highly regarded scholars in their respective fields. One must wonder how much rich enlightenment of the university's students and faculty was lost as a consequence of the Davis, Market, Nickerson, of Davis and Nickerson being forced out of the University of Michigan. People should be inspired by the failings of the past to do better. Although not in an academic setting, similar behavior was shown by the uncivilized rioters on January 6, 2021, who left feces and urine in the hallways of the offices while mobbing the U.S. Capitol. In this case, they chose to disagree with the results of a democratically sanctioned election, but in doing so undermined the sanctity of the Constitution that protects their and our privileged way of life as U.S. citizens. In a meeting with SACUA, former President Bollinger was asked if another McCarthy-type era could occur. His response was, quote, "How we treat the discussion will be one of the things that will lay the foundation for our reaction when the next witch hunt comes along," end quote. As recently as 2011, the U.S. Select Committee reviewed whether the Bush administration and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, was attempting to disseminate negative information about Middle Eastern scholar Juan Cole. University of Michigan, Richard P. Mitchell, Collegiate Professor of History, in order to discredit his critical views of the Bush administration's handling of the Iraq War. President Cole is here, so they didn't put him in jail, I guess. In that instance, Professor Cole was publicly supported at all administrative levels. President Mary Sue Coleman, Provost Philip Hanlon, and Edward Rothman, chair of the SACUA, commented on the university's commitment to academic freedom. Quote, "The standard of academic freedom is incorporated throughout the fabric of the university. The principles of academic freedom are ones we will always uphold and defend." That was on April 19, 2011, and the quote is from the Office of the Vice President for Communications. In conclusion, former University of Michigan President Mark Schlissel, in his address to the winter 2015 graduates, stated that a horrible mistake had been made. Quote, "In 1954, the university ignored both constitutional rights and long-held academic values. As members of the University of Michigan class of 2015, I hope that you can do better than our community did in 1954. Yet, as of this day, there's been no apology from the University of Michigan Regents in any form to the 3 honorees, or indeed to the many others who were persecuted, forced out because of being unwelcomed or dismissed from the University of Michigan during the Red Scare. On November the 13th, 1990, after the University of Michigan Regents declined to support the recommendation of SACUA, a letter was sent to the Regents over my signature as chair of SACUA to inform them that the DMN had been established by the Senate Assembly to apologize in some form to Davis, Market, and Nickerson. Former Regent Dean Baker approached me at a Regents SACUA dinner the evening the letter had been received by the Regents and told me we had made a mistake. The success of the DMN series, providing many scholarly diverse views on the moral and ethical bases for academic freedom, contradicts that opinion. It is not overreaching to say that today, more than a quarter of a century after the first DMN, the understanding and appreciation of the common good of academic freedom has moved to the forefront on the University of Michigan campuses. In addition to the exceptional DMN lecturers whom we have been privileged to attract, I would be remiss in not bringing attention to the exceptional work done by members of the AFLF Board of Directors, individuals such as Juan Cole, Lou DeLacy, Peter Duran, Gary Krenz, Tom Moore, Alan Law, and many others. And on its advisory board, the first who was a member was former University of Michigan President Lee Bollinger, as well as a number of our previous DMN lecturers. They were actively engaged in fulfilling the objectives of promoting academic and intellectual freedom. In addition, early pioneers Wilfred Kaplan in mathematics and my late husband, Charles Smith, TAD, and pharmacology worked tirelessly in the AAUP and AFLF to make reality our collective vision to correct and judicious pronouncement. Finally, on a personal note, Tad and I on one occasion following a DMN drove Chandler from Ann Arbor to Windsor, Canada to catch his train to Toronto. It was a bright, sunny day. Chandler inquired about the general academic freedom activities in which Tad and Wilfred Kaplan had been engaged, both locally and nationally, with the DMN. The two of them then chatted with much amusement and pleasure, reminiscing about classes they took at Harvard College, although generations apart, with the same faculty members. Their conversation turned to their professional lives and other topics of mutual interest. It was my personal good fortune to sit in the back seat quietly, listening to the conversation of two well-educated intellectuals for whom I had great respect, that obviously had many common bonds of solidarity and values. One can only imagine, although their earthly voices have now been silenced, Chandler, Wilfred, also a Harvard graduate, and Taz sitting in a sunny spot, continuing to enjoy each other's companionship. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. I wonder if any of the panelists have questions for their colleagues up here, or reactions.
I think maybe we need just to clarify the Marker situation in terms of his being tenured. And that's one of several issues that I think needs to be further investigated in this area. My understanding is that there's substantial documentation showing that the plan was not to tenure him, that he was sort of left cover for the other actions against Davis and the overruling of committees around Nickerson, and that Hatcher was going to prevent the tenuring. And I believe there, in Ellen Schrecker's book, there's some documentation about that. And maybe it's in your book, there's documentation that the publicity director of UM met with the Red Squad in Detroit and assured them that Markert was going to be fired.
With the FBI.
It was the FBI. And actually what seemed to happen was that he received a counteroffer from Johns Hopkins, and that propelled the zoology department to want to tenure him here. And he did get tenure, and then there was no counteroffer to Johns Hopkins, and he left suspicious about what his future would be. That's the picture I have so far on the evidence that's available. The only countervailing evidence I've ever seen has just been those interviews that Adam did for Keeping in Mind, where I believe both Hatcher and Niehaus say, "Oh no, we were going to tenure him. Nobody was persecuted here." I mean, they're not very reliable interviews, from what I can tell. That's the only answer I've seen on the Markert question.
So what I can determine is that Markert was up for tenure at the time that he was subpoenaed, and they stopped the tenure process. So he was most of the way through the tenure process successfully, but then they stopped it when he got the subpoena. That it was the intention. So he had one more year left on his assistant professor's contract, and as Alan said, the FBI was told that it was Hatcher's intention to not renew his contract, that he let him off to not renew intended not to renew his contract. And at the time, Markert received assurance from the dean that he would be able to stay for more than 1 year, because otherwise he was going to look for jobs. And somehow during that period he was allowed to stay for 2 years, come up for tenure, and he was successful. But as during the tenure process he got other offers and decided to leave. But there's no evidence that he went to Johns Hopkins on a full professorship. I see no evidence that they ever tried to match the associate professorship that he was given at Michigan.
I wonder if we could maybe in some ways pick up a little bit on Peggy's discussion of families. I think it's the case, but correct me, I think it's the case that Markert and Nickerson certainly greatly respected the approach that Chandler took in pleading only the first. But they felt that they just were not in a position to do that, given family situation and so forth, given the risks. But nobody does any of this, I suppose, without some sort of what we would now call a support group, right? I mean, people who are your sounding board and people who are kind of helping you think things through. And I wonder if anybody has any insights into that for Chandler or for any of these people.
Yeah, as I mentioned here, it seems that the Davis family really had individuals around them, wherever they were, whether they were here or when they moved to Rhode Island. There were individuals who were supportive of them. And as I mentioned, the psychological effect of that was enormous. Nickerson, the family did not have it, and they suffered greatly because of that. And so one of the things that I didn't mention is that even when they were packing to leave, they didn't know whether or not they would be able to immigrate to Canada. And so it was just sort of an ongoing situation with these families that were being separated. The other thing with Samantha, the Markers, she said that the family there refused to even discuss that in the home. And so it was a way of just denying that it ever happened. And that's how you got through this, by doing that. And also, of course, I'm sorry. His situation was quite different because he was permitted to stay. But it seems that the effect on the family was still traumatic. And so you can't say that nothing happened to the family because he wasn't fired. You can only say that what happened to them happened in a different way.
So Natalie was very supportive of Chandler's stand with HUAC, that she had independently come to the same conclusion that he should take the First Amendment. She disagreed on his stand with the university. She felt that he should have said that he was no longer a member of the party, but otherwise was very supportive. And while I'm here, there's one thing I would just like to mention, and that is there's two people who have sort of gotten forgotten. The DMN thing is wonderful, but there were two graduate students who were also victims of all this who have sort of gotten forgotten. Ed Schaefer and Myron Sharp were graduate students in economics who took the Fifth Amendment, and their department silently acted against them to sabotage their careers. So the university didn't formally act against them, but their department did. And I think that those two people also need to be remembered. Not to criticize the wonderful DMN thing, but they were also victims of the university's action.
The other thing that wasn't mentioned during any of our discussions was the fact that the University of Michigan, whether you see some of the administration or some of the auxiliary committees, is that all universities throughout the United States did not take that same position. There were universities that were supportive of their faculty. I guess Harvard was one of them, and in fact had, established an academic freedom policy prior to the incidents in the McCarthy era. And also, there was Harold Taylor at Sarah Lawrence, who I guess took a lot of flack for his position, even to the point of obtaining legal counsel for faculty who were to be brought before these committees. So there were universities and colleges that did help their faculty, but unfortunately, it wasn't the case here.
I would say Harvard was mixed in how supportive they were.
What do you say? It was mixed?
Mixed.
Cindy
mixed.
Diamond was dismissed from Harvard, right, and went to Columbia. There's a lot in the New York Review of Books about that case.
There were people on untenured positions who were let go at the end of their contracts. There was pressure on graduate students to name names to the FBI. So Harvard was very mixed.
So they were good at their propaganda.
Good at right. They were good at the propaganda. That they excelled at.
Okay, well, I'd like to open it up to the audience. So if you're online, you can put questions in the chat, and Andrew will present them. If you're here, I'd appreciate it if you'd use I'll bring you the microphone. I'd appreciate it if you'd use the microphone so that we can get you on the video. Thanks.
Mostly, I would actually, it's more of a memory and a thankful memory. So as a 2003 master's student at Wayne State University, who was getting my final master's research paper on HUAC in Detroit, I reached out to Chandler Davis when he was coming to the Academic Freedom Lecture and asked him if I could interview him. And he was so gracious and so kind, and we had a lovely interview. We walked down State Street as I was interviewing him with all my papers, and I was trying to take notes, and he was very kind and open, and it was just such a lovely memory and kindness of what he wanted to do for students who were learning. It really meant a lot. It just kind of said a lot about his character, about how great he was as a teacher, and it meant so much to him to continue that. So lovely memory, and I've been to every Academic Freedom Lecture since. And so when this came up, I was so excited. A secondary question that I wrote down, I'm kind of curious if you talked a little bit about the connection between Harvard, the connection between U of M's response being a state institution that receives tax money and regents who are elected officials versus private institutions, how that plays in, if you can speak a little bit to that, or where that fits in.
Because I would have no way of knowing that because I'm not in the administration. But if you go back to the comment that former President Bollinger made, he said he thought it was an institutional problem and not an individual one. I mean, if that's true, and he was a former president, I'm assuming that he's looking at it both from his position as dean of the law school and also as president of the university. So, I mean, that's the extent of my knowledge about it. So I can't comment it further.
I would just recommend, if you're not familiar with it already, the book No Ivory Tower by Ellen Schrecker, where she goes into what happened at lots of universities, and it's mostly bad.
There is one scholarly article by Mark Engberg called McCarthyism in the Academic Profession in the American Educational History Journal, which makes claims about the economic situation that I haven't seen elsewhere, that Michigan had a lot of Defense Department contracts and other contracts with the government, and that one of Hatcher's motivations was he wanted to protect these, and he felt that if he didn't make an alliance with HUAC, that UM would lose those contracts. I haven't seen anybody else talk about that, and I don't really know how to investigate it, but that's one aspect.
The question of is this an institutional failure or individual failures, right? I mean, clearly, it's all. The answer to that is always both, right? I mean,
Exactly.
there's an institutional environment, and yet we have a situation in which Hatcher really, in some ways, took some extraordinary measures in order to accomplish ends. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think.
Well, Hatcher has a very strong defense network. I mean, I suppose most of these people are now gone. But at the time of his 90th birthday, which was about 2 years after Ellen Schrecker's book came out, there was a tremendous outpouring of laudatory statements, and there were articles and events and meetings and so on. And what was shocking was there was no mention of this 1954 episode at all. I had read Schrecker's book, and I kind of thought, well, they're going to say that it was a tough time, there were tough decisions, mistakes were made, nobody's perfect. They just wiped it out. They did not want to talk about it. And I did write some articles in the paper at that time raising the question of 1954, and I got very vicious responses from a number of faculty, although they also revealed other things, but they're very defensive. And some of them had been radicals themselves, and they said that they were protected because Hatcher had sacrificed Davis and Nickerson. The rest of the community, and apparently there were a lot more radicals here than has ever been mentioned, because you don't want to name names, but there were people, some are public, like Roy Rappaport, very famous professor, former communist. There were many people like that, many other graduate students, and some of them apparently felt that they had been protected by, throwing these two guys to the wolves, or three guys maybe to the wolves. There has been a tendency in some of the scholarship, I think, to sort of say, well, it's just a complicated time. Nobody was perfect. After all, Davis had been a communist and so on. Communist parties got a lot of political baggage on it and so on. And, it's just everything's contingent, and really nobody's responsible. Or maybe Hatcher couldn't have done it without facilitators, and so he's not solely responsible and so on. That's one way to look at history. The other way is to say, no, there are victims and there are perpetrators and there are people who dissembled and so on. So it's a complicated mess, and that's why I'm urging it to be more research into many aspects of UM culture at that time. Let me just say that in terms of the communist presence. If there had been communists in my department, the English department, we probably would have been a lot more multicultural. I mean, if somebody were to go back and look at the syllabi for the English department and what writers they taught, I doubt that they even taught Richard Wright or Langston Hughes back then. I mean, the first black professor appeared in 1969, Robert Hayden, who, by the way, said he was not a black writer. He was just a poet. And if we looked at the history department, I wonder in the 50s how they taught slavery and racism. I wonder about how they taught the Second World War. Were they willing to acknowledge that the Soviet Union was absolutely decisive in defeating Nazi Germany? I mean, that's clear, but I just question what the quality of thought here. And the communists certainly would not have been reliable on the Soviet Union, but on American history, even somebody like Herbert Aptheker, who's probably the archetypal dogmatic Stalinist, wrote wonderful stuff about slave revolts when it was being denied by the rest of the academy. So probably the communist presence intellectually would have been somewhat beneficial. None of this is really explored. I mean, I've gone on the websites and so on, that's some about the university's background, and it's all kind of vague about what the culture was like. So it's a complicated matter, and assessing Hatcher is also troubling because there's so little information about him that I could find. I did look into his role in the 60s, and basically when the faculty tried to have educational events around Vietnam and called upon students, the moratorium and stuff like that, to attend these instead of their classes, he came out against that and said, no, you must believe and trust our leaders. This is about 1964. Mm-hmm. That was his attitude. You must not miss classes. That's totally inappropriate. Now, what our leaders were saying about 1964 was totally false, according to the Pentagon Papers and other pretty reliable documents. So, Hatcher himself was not such a great judge about academic matters. But I'd like to see all this reevaluated. Really a great subject for students to research.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm just interested about other universities in Michigan and their response during this period. I'm thinking of Wayne and your research. And the other question is, beyond the universities, was there, I knew people who lived through that period, but I didn't sufficiently ask them about this. Where were the voices in Michigan? Was there anybody who participated in the Have You No Shame movement?
Well, there were 200 UM professors. Did I read this in your manuscript? There were 200 University of Michigan professors who signed a public statement denouncing Hatcher at the beginning of this. And I believe that all their names are kept in the files of this Marvin Niehaus and so on. So we know there was that protest. We know that the Michigan Daily wrote editorials against what was being done, and that there was a lot of student support. But I think it's pretty poorly researched. But it was definitely present.
And other universities that were either targeted or had a more robust response?
Nothing as huge as this, I would say.
Others? Angela? Yeah.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question. The comment is just that, thanks for talking about the families. I think this is a really important aspect. And I think, I've always been struck by Chan and Natalie as a radical couple. And I sometimes think that, kind of Chan eclipses everything that Natalie would have been doing in the same period and, out of the same commitments. And so forth. And so I think kind of thinking about it that way is a really nice thing to be able to do. The question is to ask you to say a little bit more about these committees. I mean, I'm just really struck in the story that it's committee after the committee, and it's like shopping for the committee that's going to do the thing that you need it to do to throw enough institutional cover. I mean, I have to say, kind of learning more about that even makes me kind of suspicious of being asked to serve on any committees now. Because I kind of want to know, what are you trying to hide by having this committee, right? I mean, I just think, you know, as a question of institutional practice, that seems to me to be an area to investigate even further as well. And I wonder if you had more to say about that.
I think I alluded to that in my comments, that individuals were saying it's unfortunate this is happening to you, but I'll just keep my cover and go along with this because there'll be no benefit to me to support you. And unfortunately, that still is the situation. That has not changed. I mean, we're not talking about McCarthyism or anything, but that still is the situation. I think in any large organization, not just an academic institution, I think that's in any large organization that individuals will do things that will be beneficial to themselves rather than to the community at large. That sounds very pessimistic, doesn't it?
I feel like I'm always stealing your material. Look, the committee thing it does seem like a lot of subterfuge because we know the Ellison Executive Committee immediately called for the reinstatement of both Davis and Nickerson. I'm sorry, Davis and Marker. Nickerson was over in a different, in the medical school. And then Hatcher appointed this ad hoc committee headed by Smith, about whom I don't know too much. This committee actually, although it was appointed by Hatcher, didn't come up with the right result, right? They wanted to keep Nickerson. They were happy to get rid of Davis. The committee set up by SACUA was headed up by Campbell, I guess Campbell, and it was often said that this was a very prominent, prestigious person. But I saw online, I don't know whether other people have seen this, a memo from David Hollinger to Fran Bluen, correcting things that were said in his, Hollinger sort of opened up a lot of this discussion around it was after Schrecker's book, it must have been 1987 or
80, I think it was 87, yeah.
Rackham, and then later to Fran Bluen, he sent in corrections that were made by Chan Davis and Libby Duvan and other people. This is online. It's not a book, like it's just a couple of pages, which I found fascinating. But Duvan claimed that actually Campbell was not that widely respected, and that he was very concerned about support for the ISR, the Institute for Social Research, and keeping funding so that, he had motivation to say what Hatcher wanted. Although, again, this committee, which was a SACUA subcommittee, did not say what Hatcher wanted on the Nickerson case, so Hatcher had to overrule that too. So it would be nice to know the names of all the people on these committees and, what interests they had and things like that. They were divided, contentious committees. Even when they came out against Davis, there were some internal disputes.
Which I think that is important to remember too. I mean, you look back on history and you see things as done deals, but there was a lot of internal division, right?
Yeah, I should say in this memo, which is online, I think you have to look up the name David Hollinger, Fran Bluen. It does say that Chan objected to Hollinger's big emphasis on the decision-making processes of these committees because he felt that Hatcher from the beginning had this position, the AAU position, and that he was going to follow through on it no matter what. And so these deliberations were kind of a kindergarten for people to play around in, make it look like the university is really discussing these things, but that in the end they didn't mean much. Because Hatcher from the beginning had the power to make that final decision. I don't know how it's possible, but this one man could overrule faculty committees and, in this case, fire Nickerson outright against these faculty committees.
Well, I think the regents had the final say, but the regents were going to go along with Hatcher. So effectively Hatcher, well, de facto he had the power, but maybe not the juror. But one thing I'd like to say is that I think the efforts against the left were really widespread through the university through the administration and through the faculty. There are more people from the left who had their careers sabotaged by administrators, but both the Dean of Men and the Dean of Women were involved with the FBI and the state police in Michigan. We have the president and the vice president. There were faculty department heads that were writing letters of recommendation that said that students were involved in liberal activities, which were code words for communism. This was really widespread. And the other thing I'd like to say is that none of the two committees that supposedly had a say supported Chandler, that they both concluded that he was being devious. And devious was a trope for communists, even though they didn't know for sure he was a communist. So the fact that they said he was devious was a really horrible thing. And both committees said this.
I think we have time for one more question. Does anybody? Okay, well, thank you all so much. This has been a great discussion. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming. And again, we're open upstairs for about 25 more minutes if you'd like to take a look at the observatory. Otherwise, just again, thank you, and try to stay warm, especially tomorrow morning, from what I understand.
Really, that's what I heard. It's gonna get worse.
Your stuff on those two graduate students and your book is really just